Hello and welcome to part 2 of this talk about politics in the UK. In part 1 we looked at the UK political system, in particular the House of Commons and how MPs are elected, and Her Majesty's government. Today we'll be taking a closer look at the House of Lords, the role of the monarch, and the judiciary and the Supreme Court. So let's start off by taking a closer look at the House of Lords, the second chamber in the Houses of Parliament. Now, if you remember, the UK Parliament is made up of three parts: the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarchy. One of the big differences between the House of Commons and the House of Lords is the way the members are chosen. In the Commons, the 650 members of Parliament, or MPs, are elected by the people, by the electorate. In the House of Lords, the majority of the members are appointed by the monarch on the advice of the Prime Minister. It's also the Commons where the government ministers like the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and the principal figures of the main political parties work. So what does the House of Lords do? Well, it's independent from, but at the same time complements the work of the House of Commons. It makes laws, holds the government to account, and debates issues of public interest. However, we have to remember that it's only the Commons that is responsible for making decisions on financial bills, such as new taxes. The Lords can consider these bills, but it can't block them or amend them. Now let's have a look at a little bit of history. Where did it all start? Originally, the Lords were wise men drawn together to advise the Saxon monarchs who ruled more than 1,000 years ago. Then, in the 14th century, two houses of Parliament began to emerge. On the one hand, there were the representatives from towns and counties who began to meet as the House of Commons, and on the other, the Lords Spiritual and Temporal formed the House of Lords. The Lords Spiritual, as the name implies, were senior members of the clergy, archbishops and bishops, and the Lords Temporal were noblemen, earls and barons, who'd been born into the peerage. Well, this situation continued for many centuries, but then at the beginning of the 20th century, people began to question whether it wasn't time to have life peers. So peers who were appointed by the government for life rather than on a hereditary basis. And it was finally in 1958 that the Life Peerages Act was passed, and it was important for two reasons. Because it created peerages for life, but it was also the first time that women were allowed to sit in the Lords as life peers. 5 years later, those hereditary peeresses, so those who'd been born into the peerage, were finally also allowed to take their seats in the House of Lords. In 1999, there came the House of Lords Act, which removed the right of most hereditary peers to sit and vote in the House. 666 hereditary peers lost this right, and only 92 were allowed to remain until further reform had been proposed. Then in 2005 came the Constitutional Reform Act, and this brought sweeping changes to the judiciary and the House of Lords. Up till this point, the House of Lords had been the highest court in the United Kingdom. So who are the members of the House of Lords? Well, unlike the House of Commons, membership is not an office or a job. Most members' main employment is or has been outside of Parliament. So this means that quite a few members have a political background, whilst others bring experience from a range of fields. They might have worked in business or in the field of culture. They might have worked in medicine, science, sports, law, education. And this is very important because they're bringing a lot of very diverse knowledge to their role of examining matters of public interest that affect all UK citizens. Now, interestingly, unlike the House of Commons, the number of seats in the House of Lords isn't fixed. There's no upper limit on the number of members. So currently there are around 800 members, or peers as they're known as. And the members are made up as follows. There are 26 members of senior clergy from the Church of England, the established church in the UK. So these are archbishops and bishops. We have 92 elected hereditary peers. But the majority of the members, around 700 of them, are life peers. So they're people who've been elevated to the peerage through something they've done through their life work. How are life peers appointed? As said before, life peers are appointed for their lifetime by the monarch on the advice of the Prime Minister. They're not chosen because they come from a particular region of the United Kingdom or a particular constituency, but they're chosen because they'll have skills and area of interest that will help the country. Now, some of them are chosen in the dissolution honours, so some MPs might be appointed life peers when they leave the House of Commons once their time as serving as an MP is up. Others will be chosen when a Prime Minister resigns in the so called resignation honours. So, if a Prime Minister resigns, they can recommend peerages for fellow politicians, political advisors, or others who've supported them. There's the political lists. These are lords who are appointed to boost the strengths of the main parties in Parliament. And then finally, traditionally, former speakers of the House of Commons are elevated to the peerage once they have finished and stepped down as speakers of the House. Now, this wasn't the case with John Bercow because he'd been seen as rather a controversial figure during the Brexit negotiations, and so he was denied this peerage when he retired. Life peers can also be appointed by the House of Lords Appointments Commission. They recommend individuals for appointment as non-party political life peers, which means that any British, Irish or Commonwealth citizen who's a UK resident and taxpayer and is over the age of 21 can be nominated or can apply even themselves to become a member via this commission. At the same time, the Commission is very important because it vets the nominations for life peers, including those nominated by the UK political parties, and this is very important to ensure that the highest standards are kept to. Now, there are two key members in the House of Lords, the first of which is the Lord Speaker. The Lord Speaker presides over the House of Lords and is similar in that respect to his or her counterpart in the House of Commons, the Speaker. However, unlike the Speaker in the House of Commons, the Lord Speaker doesn't control or manage the House of Lords. The House of Lords are considered to be self-regulating, which means that his or her role is to guide and help the House during debate, but he or she has no power to call members to order or to decide who speaks next in a debate. But they do call for divisions, votes, when necessary. This is interesting too because in the House of Lords, people vote by saying content or not content. In the House of Commons, they vote by saying aye or no. But in the House of Lords, it's a little bit more formal. The Lord Speaker is elected by members of the House of Lords for a period of 5 years, and this can be renewed once. And once the Lord Speaker becomes takes up this role, they can't belong to any party and is not allowed to vote. They also have to represent the House of Lords on state occasions. The other important member of the House of Lords is the Leader of the House of Lords. The Leader of the House is a member of the Cabinet and is the most senior member of the government in the Lords. This person is responsible for the government's business in the House. He or she leads a team of about 25 ministers and whips and is appointed by the Prime Minister. Their role is to lead the government benches in the House of Lords, to take part in formal ceremonies in the House, such as the state opening of Parliament, and importantly too, to repeat statements that the Prime Minister made to the House of Commons in the House of Lords. The current leader of the House of Lords is a lady, it's Baroness Evans of Bowes Park. Now, if you're interested in taking a peek inside the House of Lords, you might want to go to Parliament Live TV and actually watch them in session. One of the first things that you'll notice when you look inside the House of Lords is how sumptuous everything looks. There are these wonderful dark red benches where the Lords sit. Dark red is the colour that symbolises the House of Lords. And we've got wonderful wooden panelling and lots of gold. And at the far end, of course, all the gold of the throne, where the monarch sits when they come to open Parliament at the state opening of Parliament every year. But if you look closely, you'll see some things that are a bit different to the House of Commons. To begin with, we've got a big, large bench that's covered in a red cloth in front of the throne, with a smaller red cushion at its back. This is called the woolsack, and it really is a large cushion full of wool, covered in red cloth, and it's where the Lord Speaker sits. It's stuffed with wool brought from all around the Commonwealth, and it dates back to the reign of Edward III, when the wool trade was one of the most important parts of the economy, and so the seat is a traditional symbol of the wealth of the country. At the beginning of every day, when the House of Lords is in session, the Lord Speaker processes from the offices within the House of Lords to the chamber and is preceded by the Sergeant at Arms who carries the mace. The mace is placed behind the Lord Speaker, and this symbolises the presence of the monarchy. And then Parliament, the House of Lords, is allowed to sit, is in session, as we say. In front of the woolsack, we have two more long red seats that are covered in a red cloth, and these are called the judges' woolsack. During the state opening of Parliament, this is where the senior judges sit, and it's a reminder of medieval parliaments when the judges attended to offer legal advice. Now, during normal sittings of the House, any member of the Lords can sit there, so you'll often see people sitting there because they get a closer view of the proceedings. The government Lords, the government side of the House of Lords, is on the right-hand side of the Speaker. And interestingly, too, this is where the bishops sit. If you look at the photograph very closely, you'll see that these benches closest to the Lord Speaker's woolsack, have armrests, and that's where the bishops and the clergy sit. The opposition sits on the other side of the chamber with members of the smaller parties. And then we have some benches that are at crossways, so they're not in line with the government or opposition benches, and these are where the crossbenchers sit. Crossbenchers don't belong to any political party, and so they sit here in between both of them on neutral ground, if you like. Well, as we said before, the UK Parliament is divided into three parts. We have the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the monarchy. But what is the monarch's role? Monarchy is the oldest form of government in the United Kingdom. Remember, we have a constitutional monarchy, and we are a parliamentary democracy. This means that the sovereign is head of state, but the ability to make and pass legislation resides with an elected parliament. The monarchy and government have two very different roles. Walter Bagehot wrote a very important book in 1867 called The English Constitution. He was the editor of The Economist magazine, and he said that the Constitution was divided into two branches. He said, "No one can approach to an understanding of the English institutions, or of others, which, being the growth of many centuries, exercise a wide sway over mixed populations, unless he divide them into two classes. In such constitutions there are two parts. First, those which excite and preserve the reverence of the population, the dignified parts, if I may so call them, and next the efficient parts, those by which it in fact works and rules." Well, what he's talking about here is trying to separate the monarchy, who represents the dignified branch. Its job is to symbolize the state through pomp and ceremony, through mystery, and the efficient part, which is the government or parliament, the cabinet and the civil service, whose job it is to run the country by passing laws and providing public services. The dignified branch governs through poetry and mystique, and the efficient part governs through prose and getting things done. The monarch is our head of state, and as it says on the royal website, as head of state, the Queen has to remain strictly neutral with respect to political matters, unable to vote or stand for election. However, Her Majesty does have important ceremonial and formal roles in relation to the government of the UK. So, what is the monarch's role in Parliament? Well, one of the most important things is granting royal assent. Once a bill has been passed by both houses of Parliament, it gets taken to the monarch and the monarch has to sign it. Only then does it become an act of Parliament. Now, this is a formality. The last time the monarch refused to do so was over 300 years ago, but nevertheless, it's an important formality. The monarch is also responsible for appointing the Prime Minister of her government. After a general election, the leader of the party that has the majority is appointed Prime Minister. The Queen is also responsible for opening and closing each session of Parliament. Now, they only open Parliament in person. and read the Queen's speech. But when Parliament is closed, a speech is read in the Queen's name in the House of Lords and in the presence of the House of Commons. And it's actually an interesting fact that the Prime Minister has to approve everything that the Queen does or says in public. So although it's called the Queen's speech, it's not actually written by her, it's written by the government. There is one time a year when she is allowed to give her own speech that she has written herself, and this is her Christmas Day message to her people, and she writes this without input from Downing Street. Or very occasionally, such as in times of crisis, like the corona crisis, she writes an address to the nation, and this is given without input from Downing Street. Another very important part of her role is she has the right to be consulted, to encourage and to warn her ministers via regular audiences with the Prime Minister. This means that she meets the Prime Minister once a week or phones him or her, and this is all done in the strictest of confidence. And she has a right and a duty to give advice on government matters. So people often say, I wonder whether the Queen talked about Brexit with the Prime Minister. And of course, Brexit will have been discussed, but it's very much would have been done behind closed doors, and we'll never really know what was said in those behind those closed doors. The state opening of Parliament is a very important occasion, and it's when the Queen comes to Parliament and addresses both houses. And there's a lot of tradition to do with this occasion. In this photo, you'll see beefeaters from the Tower of London, yeomen of the guard, and they're about to pick up their lanterns and go and check the cellars in the House of Lords. This is, of course, because of Guy Fawkes, all those centuries ago when Guy Fawkes planted gunpowder in the cellar of the Houses of Parliament because he wanted to blow up Parliament. And so even today, with all our modern technology, the beefeaters still go and check the cellars beneath the Houses of Parliament to see if there's gunpowder or anything that shouldn't be there before the monarch comes to Parliament. Once this has been done, the monarch arrives in a gold coach and is accompanied by various members of her family, and then proceeds to go into the House of Lords and sits down on the throne. As we can see here, is seated with the heir to the throne, Prince Charles, and then reads the Queen's speech. But before this happens, the House of Commons has to come. Because this is happening in the House of Lords, the House of Commons is waiting to be invited to join the monarch in the House of Lords. And this is also shrouded in tradition. Black Rod, the emissary, the envoy of the House of Lords, is sent to the House of Commons to ask them to come and join the Queen. But what happens here is, as soon as the House of Commons sees Black Rod approaching, they slam the doors of the chamber closed in Black Rod's face. Black Rod then has to tap 3 times on the door, which is then opened, and then asks the House of Commons if they will come and join the Queen. This is to show the independence of the House of Commons from the monarch, and this has been a tradition since after the Civil War. The House of Commons then processes, following the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, to the House of Lords, and the Queen reads out the speech. Now, although it's called the Queen's Speech, as I said before, it's not actually written by the Queen. It's drafted by the government and outlines the government's policy for the coming session of Parliament and indicates forthcoming legislation that they want to propose during this period. Neither house can proceed to public business until the Queen's speech has been read. Well, we've now come to the last part of the talk about the judiciary and the Supreme Court. You might remember when we were talking about the House of Lords and a little bit of history, we talked about the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. And this was very important because it introduced sweeping changes into the way that the House of Lords and the judiciary were organised. Up till then, the highest court in the UK had been the House of Lords. It was the Supreme Court of Appeal on points of law for the whole of the UK in civil cases and for England, Wales and Northern Ireland in criminal cases. But with the Constitutional Reform Act, it was the first time in almost 900 years that judicial independence was officially enshrined in law. This meant that an independent Supreme Court was finally established. So instead of having the House of Lords being our Supreme Court, this was now a separate entity. Before this, as I said, the House of Lords was the highest court, and the 12 most senior judges in the land, the so-called law lords, had sat in the House of Lords. In addition, the Constitutional Reform Act reformed the role of the Lord Chancellor. Now, the Lord Chancellor is one of the oldest offices of states, and it dates back many, many centuries. And before these reforms, the Lord Chancellor had many roles. They were Speaker in the House of Lords, a Cabinet Minister, and the head of the judiciary. And this was considered to be actually against the idea of separation of powers because we had in one person a member of the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And the feeling was that this person wouldn't be impartial enough if a member of as a member of the government to guarantee everybody a fair trial, as was laid down in law. So the powers were then separated, and there were three roles created out of this one role. The Lord Chief Justice, who previously had been a subordinate to the Lord Chancellor, was now created head of the judiciary. A new role was created, the Lord Speaker, who became the Speaker in the House of Lords, and the Lord Chancellor remained a senior member of the Cabinet and Secretary of State for Justice, but was no longer present in the House of Lords as the Speaker and no longer head of the judiciary. The Supreme Court opened on the 1st of October 1999 and it was moved to a building opposite the Houses of Parliament. While the law lords had previously sat in the Houses of Parliament, it was thought very important that there was a new building that was actually separate from the Houses of Parliament to house our Supreme Court. And this location is considered quite symbolic as well. It's moved into the Guildhall, which is in Parliament, the Middlesex Guildhall, which is in Parliament Square, and the location symbolises the relationship between the two. On the one hand, Parliament makes the laws, and on the other, the Supreme Court oversees their ultimate interpretation and fair and just use. So even through the symbolism of the buildings, they're watching each other. The Supreme Court has 12 justices. That's what the judges at the Supreme Court are called. And they have the final say on the biggest legal issues in the country. The first 12 were the law lords from the House of Lords. These judges are the ultimate checks and balances on UK law and constitution. The new justices are appointed by the Queen on the recommendation of a panel of legal experts from each of the United Kingdom nations, and applicants have to have been a High Court judge for at least 2 years or a practicing lawyer for 15, so they need a lot of experience. Each time a case is heard, there is an odd number of justices who are doing so that there's always a majority ruling. This is very important so that we don't end up with a situation where there's a stalemate. Probably the most famous case to date has been the ruling on the Prime Minister's prorogation of Parliament for 5 weeks in summer 2019. In that case, the 11 justices unanimously ruled that the Prime Minister had been unlawful in proroguing Parliament for such a long period of time. Now, while the Supreme Court's role is to decide on the correct interpretation of laws, it's only Parliament who can pass or cancel laws. So the Supreme Court does not have any power in this respect. And since October 2009, it's actually heard and decided on more than 835 cases, so it is kept quite busy. Well, to sum up, what is the UK political system? At the top, we have the monarch, who is our head of state. We have the House of Commons, that is our elected legislature. We have the House of Lords, that's our appointed legislature and our second chamber in the Houses of Parliament. We have Her Majesty's government, which is the executive, and we have a Supreme Court, which is our judiciary. What we haven't talked about are the devolved governments that we have in the UK, the governments of Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, and we'll be looking at a little bit at these in another talk when we talk about devolution in the United Kingdom. But that's it for the moment. I hope it's been interesting and given you a little insight into the UK political situation. If you do have any comments or anything you'd like to say, please do drop me a line. And otherwise, I hope that this has been useful and that you'll join me again for another talk. Thanks for coming. Bye bye.